Welcome to chapter 5. With this chapter and all the ones going forward for the most part, it is just going to be telling us the story. We're going to forget that it's Nellie telling Lockwood the story of Wuthering Heights. That I love that Emily Bronte kind of does it because then you forget that Nellie is a biased narrator. She's not unreliable. She's biased, and there's a slight difference between the two. She's not purposely lying to us. She just has a skewed perspective of things. And because we are not reminded that Nellie is telling this tale to Lockwood, we are taking often the story as fact. And I, like, for instance, this opening paragraph of chapter 5 would have taken it as is every other reading, all dozen or so or more times I've read it in the past. But this time, because I'm analyzing the book, I have like a certain part of my brain kind of turned on and I'm overthinking and over like analyzing every line. And for instance, I don't think I like noticed or really thought much about like this opening line of chapter 5 where it says, in the course of time Mr. Earnshaw began to fail. He had been active and healthy, yet his strength left him suddenly, and when he was confined to the chimney corner he grew grievously irritable. And this sentence snagged me. And my own personal perspective, I like ghost stories. I love reading them. I love watching haunted movies. I love hearing the retellings. And whether you believe it or not, and even I myself am not entirely one side or the other, sometimes it feels very fictional. Sometimes I have my own experiences. Like you have, it's gray. It's a gray area. But there's something about often the stories involving demonic possession where the person that is possessed is often told to have done a 180 with their personality. They change so drastically, and that is kind of what we're seeing here. And I kind of like that Nellie does not outright tell the readers or Lockwood that Heathcliff is a demon child. He is a demon. He is horrible, but she is presenting him almost as though he is that. That because Heathcliff had come in this home, the master of the house, Kathy's father, Mr. Earnshaw, had changed so drastically from someone that had once been healthy and active to being confined to one corner of the house, from someone that was so kind and gentle to being very irritable and easily to rage. But we also have to remember, we don't know if Nellie is skewing this tale, making him sound better than he is. This is something that is not uncommon. Think of stories of those who have passed, or even if you listen to any true crime stories or anything like that, or Dateline, there's this joke of like how the victims are being presented in a very, very positive light, which the victims should be humanized, obviously, but it's interesting how we remove some of the negative traits because all of a sudden we don't want to present them as a potentially flawed human who equally did not deserve to die. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, that like Nellie is not presenting him as a horrible person. Like she presented him in the last chapter as a very kind and gentle man, even though like he did kick her out of the house for putting Heathcliff on the steps to sleep. Like she doesn't present him negatively until this moment, and she is presenting it and framing it in a way that is because of Heathcliff's presence in this household. The rest of the opening paragraph is kind of quickly letting us know the relationship and the dynamics of this household. How, Mr. Earnshaw would be very upset if someone would impose or domineer over his favorite. And he's also, though, that seeming to have gotten it into his head, the notion that because he liked Heathcliff, all hated and longed to do him ill turn. It was a disadvantage for the lad, for the kinder among us did not wish to fret the master, so we humored his partiality, and that humoring was rich nourishment to the child's pride and black tempers. And so we're seeing this very interesting dynamic going on, but also that like Nellie outright like Heathcliff was immediately his favorite, and that caused a lot of problems within this household. And there were members of that staff, for instance, that didn't want to earn the master's scorn, which makes sense because they could lose their jobs and their homes and everything. And so they would humor him, is how she presented it. We humored him. And because of that, it added fuel to the fire of Heathcliff's pride. of him then holding this little bit of power over others that he then all of a sudden earned. And you have to also remember that he came from the gutter, supposedly, according to Nellie, according to Mr. Earnshaw, that he had absolutely nothing, and then all of a sudden he had something, and he's using that little bit of power. So you also have to wonder what had happened previously to him that he then would need to use this little bit of power. But also, you can have a conversation about toxic masculinity, that men that have a little bit of power, how far that people are willing to go. It's not even men though, women too, that it's just people in general, that like there are certain people in the world that get a little bit of power and it kind of goes to their head that they have to use it and flaunt it and flex it to then make themselves feel like they have autonomy and control of their lives in the world. And there's so much layers that you could unpack of why this might be. But I think just the way that she's presenting Earnshaw being so upset if anyone imposed or domineered over this boy. But this didn't seem like they would do it over the other kids. But like at the same time, I think the other kids had more respect because they were the master's kids and technically above. Whereas Heathcliff, like I mentioned in a previous video, is almost the equivalent of a governess position where you're not quite staff, but you're not quite family. But you have this weird thing going on with the master of the house is trying to make him family and make him an equal. And then you have Hindley, who obviously is not going to be happy about this, that, this boy, this cuckoo, is coming in and usurping his position almost of his father's love. And he's probably fearful that his father's going to give this random child his ancestral home, which does later actually happen. But he has the right to be afraid, but he's also, as we saw in the last chapter, him and Kathy are spoiled and a little selfish and proud. And it's funny that Nellie is digging into Heathcliff's pride when it's Henley's pride also causing him to then want to hurt Heathcliff. And then we see that the master would want to pick up his stick and physically harm Henley for being mean to Heathcliff, but then was stuck confined to his corner because he was ailing. And then we get more mad that he couldn't harm Henley. So you've seen this horrible toxic dynamic going on in this household. So of course it's just gonna keep getting worse. And the funny thing or the interesting thing about this is that you can't pick one person to blame for all this, which I think Nellie's trying to blame Heathcliff, but there's not one person to blame. There's so many moving parts. You can't blame Hindley for the events that are going to happen. You can't blame Heathcliff. You can't blame Earnshaw. There's because Heathcliff was homeless and he's been giving a good home, but maybe because of his past that the power went to his head, or is Nellie just making it seem like that? We don't know, and there's too many moving parts to put the blame completely on one person. As I previously mentioned, because I'm analyzing this book, I overthink every single line, which it's fun. You don't have to do it, but it does add more meaning, more layers, and more of a think piece. You're thinking about things more. And for instance, in this line, at last our curate, and then in parentheses, we had a curate then who made the living answer by teaching the little Lintons and Earnshaws and farming his bit of land himself, advised the young man should be sent to college. It's the curate, and then the parentheses of we had a curate then, which is inferring that they don't have one now, which goes into kind of this very subtle presentation, I guess you can say, that's being provided to us, that it's being inferred that this is a heathen kind of land, this is a godless land, that they have been given into sin of pride and retributions and all these things. Remember Lockwood's dream of him being in the church. Think of, God, why am I blanking on his name? Joseph preaching and talking about that in Kathy's diary. So we're being presented this idea of then religion, and then this like idea of even this part of England, because they're not part of what is typical society, or heathens almost within their own country, within their own land, your own neighbors. Like, it's such a fascinating thing that I could pick apart probably more, but I would love to know what you think about this. So the curate advised Mr. Earnshaw that the young man should be sent to college, and Mr. Earnshaw agreed, though with a heavy spirit, for he said Hindley was not and would never thrive as where he wandered. And what Mr. Earnshaw said snagged my attention. And if it's snagging my attention, that means I should pick it apart. And I had my way I was kind of interpreting it, but it's one of those lines that it's just vague enough. It's just strange enough with the Yorkshire dialect that I decided to look and see what other people have said or how they interpreted this line. And Wuthering Heights is such a good book to kind of do a literary analysis of, because it is pretty popular in the academic sphere, that you're going to get a wealth of interpretations on the internet, especially like you're going to get a bunch of different people giving their perspective of things. So for instance, someone interpreted that line as the Hindley would never thrive or prosper where while he was wandering, that is, while he is not settled, he needs to be sent to school. Whereas another said that the fact that it was said with a heavy spirit implies that Mr. Earnshaw is sad to send Hindley away, but that unless they take him out of his present environment, where he is jealous of Heathcliff and obsessively bullies him, he will never flourish. And that's fascinating. Like, I totally believe this. I totally agree, especially with the second one, that like he needs to be taken out of this environment because he would never flourish, because he will fixate on this and it would just get worse. And he needs to go somewhere else and interact with other people. That is what Jane Austen is encouraging in Pride and Prejudice, because I'm doing a literary analysis of that. And she's encouraging that you're going to get stuck in your ways and very particular mannerisms and etiquette if you don't broaden your scope, broaden your society. And that is one way of interpreting this. But my first impression was actually that the wandering was the negative part, that by taking him out of the moors could be his negative downfall. So you can see it both ways, which this line is so vague that you can, and you can justify, you can see it as either he needs to be taken out of this environment because it's just going to get worse. He's going to keep bullying Heathcliff, and he's jealous of Heathcliff, and it's just going to dig even deeper and get worse and worse and worse unless he leaves and broadens his horizons and realizes that there's more than just this situation, which, yes, you can see that. But the other interpretation, which is how I first interpreted it, is that by leaving the moors is going to make it worse, that he is going to wander but needs to come back here to his home, which is like it mirrors Kathy's ghost, that she's been wandering the moors trying to find her way back to Wuthering Heights for the last 20 years. It's to go into how the conversation of society and how, like, yes, they're different, but like one is not better than the other, that someone might belong better in one environment than the other. Like, Lockwood doesn't quite work in this environment. He's too of a certain class, of a certain society, that it's not working for him. He's not fitting in. And Kathy herself struggled to fit within that kind of environment that Lockwood's coming from, because the Lintons are like a stepping stone towards that kind of environment. They're not quite the same deep kind of history that I feel like the Earnshaws give. Like, the Earnshaws give almost as if they are a part of the moors. They are ingrained in the moors. They are a plant within the moors, and that they're a type of plant that you can't just uproot. And with Hindley, we're going to see that him going away didn't make things any better. It actually, you could argue it could have made it worse. Maybe it made it slightly better. You don't know what it could have been if he had stayed. But his opinion on Heathcliff, his jealousy, his anger doesn't change. He just now has more heirs towards himself. I think one of the reasons why the Bronte sisters have done so well, not only in their own time, but historically, like continuing on, is because they're kind of pushing back on what society wants with the morals and trying to give a realistic view of the world. And even if it is a scary, very dark, negative view, they're putting it in your face a little bit. And, well, not putting it in your face, but slightly putting it on the table, being like, we have to acknowledge that. And this is very big, especially this time, because for at least the last handful of generations up to this point, a lot of the stories needed to have good morals and represent what society wanted within its people. For instance, that's how young female writers could write and be published, and how books could be then put in young ladies' hands. Because look at Northanger Abbey, there's a slight touching of the conversation of certain Gothic books not being appropriate for young ladies. And even Evelina by Frances Burney is stylized to be exactly what society wants your young ladies to be like. And it looks like if you keep to your morals and you're good and you're kind, then you'll eventually get the handsome lord. But there's a tongue in cheek to her story. There's a subtleness of her pointing out that this naivety that you want in your young ladies could end with their own downfall. Like, this is not a good thing. And getting back to this story, Emily Bronte is kind of touching similarly on that the world is not black and white. For instance, of her saying this line, "It hurt me to think that the master should have been made uncomfortable by his own good deed. I fancy the discontent of age and disease arose from his family's disagreements." It's showing that despite the lessons that you're being taught in church, or Joseph moralizing that be kind to thy neighbors, like, you should obviously be kind to thy neighbors, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get a reward for it. That the world doesn't work like that. Like, you could be good and have good intentions, but still be sick. That there's people in the world that you're like, they're so kind, how can they be so horribly sick and die like so young, whereas those who are terrible people somehow continue to live on way past their when they should. Or like, you have people like Heathcliff and Hindley who, despite the goodness that Earnshaw was trying to instill in them, still turn towards anger and revenge and rage and destruction. And that's why I think Emily Bronte is trying to point out that, like, the world is not black and white. You can moralize and try to teach the next generation and others to be as good as possible, but it does not mean that it will actually occur. And even if you do a good deed, does not mean that you get a reward. The villains do not get their, just downfall, even though it technically kind of happens here, but even then it's not. There's so much destruction. There's so much realness that Emily Bronte is putting here, while still kind of keeping within story elements of having villains having their downfall, if that makes sense. Another element of the story is power. There's a power dynamic being seen within the house of Wuthering Heights. And this is something that is like not only in court politics, but it can be done within a home. That is why Emily Bronte is trying to show that there's a power struggle that can be had within a home amongst many of its members. For instance, with this line of her saying that by his knack of sermonizing, speaking of Joseph the servant, and pious discoursing, he contrived to make a great impression on Mr. Earnshaw, and the more feeble the master became, the more influence he gained. So as Mr. Earnshaw's health waned, his power waned with him, and without another man kind of in the house, Joseph took that power vacuum, and that he then imposed upon Heathcliff and Kathy and others within this house, creating this very kind of toxic environment, as we're going to continue to see, of a very toxic religious environment. So you can have a very healthy religious kind of environment, as saw with Mr. Earnshaw, but now we're getting someone like Joseph, which is a more toxic view of it. And this is very interesting when you know that Emily Bronte's father was a preacher, so I think her father, if I remember right, is a very nice man. So he is representing the one side, but there are others within his same career path that are the opposite side. That, again, not black and white. Just because you're a preacher does not mean that you're a good person. Just because you're religious does not mean you're a good person, but you can be. So also, though, the power struggle, and we're going to see the power struggle continuing on with when Hindley returns, him seizing power and control, and the way that he tries to assert his power upon those within the household. And then same with Heathcliff. It is a power struggle mostly with the men, while Kathy, though, also has power. Hers is slightly quiet, or at least different. But I would like to put forth this idea that Kathy is a black hole. If you read this story, you're going to start noticing how so many people are gravitating towards her. That there's something about her that lures others in, and then she sucks them into her black hole. That while Heathcliff is being painted as a villain, Kathy is not much better. Kathy is the one that is dragging many people down with her. They're both horrible. Everyone's horrible in this story, but there's something about Kathy that we can't make her perfect, and that's what makes her interesting. She's not that perfect female main character that they would have liked in stories. She's extremely flawed, and that's what makes her fascinating. I want to read this excerpt from Nellie describing Kathy as a child. She said, Certainly she had her ways with her, such as I never saw a child take up before, and she put us all past her patience 50 times and oftener in a day. From the hour she came downstairs to the hour she went to bed, we had not a minute's security that she wouldn't be in mischief. Her spirits were always at high water mark, her tongue always going, singing, laughing, and plaguing everybody who would not do the same. A wild, wicked slip she was, but she had the bonniest eyes, and the sweetest smile, and the lightest foot in the parish. And after all, I believe she meant no harm. For when once she made you cry in good earnest, it seldom happened that she would not keep you company and oblige you to be quiet that you might comfort her. And there's a lot we can unpack here. Like I've said, I kind of picture Kathy being a black hole. There's something about her that, or even like a Venus flytrap, she lures people in and then devours them, sucks them in, and destroys them. And it's first, I want to pick on the appearance thing that she is so beautiful, as she described, the bonniest eyes, sweetest smile, lightest foot. There's something about her that is enchanting physically that many, like Nellie, are often willing to ignore such negative traits about her. Whereas Heathcliff, his appearance, they automatically assumes the worst, and then he just leans into their assumptions of him. And to me, it's fascinating because Nellie is trying to very subtly paint Heathcliff as almost a devil figure coming into this household and ruining it, whereas Kathy abides by those tropes a lot more because in these tropes with the devil or a Faustian bargain, they're often portrayed the devil figure very handsomely, very alluring, and it's then their personality and their intentions are evil. Think of, for instance, more recently, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. The Darkness or Luke is very handsome and can make his appearance to whatever the person needs or desires, but yet his intentions are evil, one could say. And that is kind of Kathy. But I also want to pick on, like, she is almost like a fairy child too, which fits within the setting. The Moors, this wild, very selfish creature, and my interpretations of fairies come very similar to Holly Black's, where like the folk are very selfish human beings. It's a very kind of bargains and deals, what can you give me kind of society. And Kathy is very selfish. She is looking for her own entertainment, her own pleasure, her own thing. And even like down to the point where like Nellie trying to say that I believe she meant no harm, for when once she made you cry in good earnest, it seldom happened that she would not keep you company and oblige you to be quiet that you might comfort her. And it's so strange because she's pretty much saying that Kathy would make other people cry but then stay with them and comfort them to the point where it's more like she's not quite comforting them, but kind of forcing them to comfort her. She's very narcissistic in that sense. Very, all right, like I do have a psych degree, but I'm haven't studied it in a long time. But there's an essence of borderline to her where she pushes and pulls at people. But I don't want to diagnose her as borderline because I can't, and I don't think she is. But there's an essence to that. So it's like fascinating how toxic, how evil Kathy is, that many forget that. Many forget because of her beauty, because of how Nellie presents her, because of Heathcliff and others' loves for her. You want to love her too, because you're like, well, surely there's something about her. But she is technically, I think, worse than Heathcliff. It's just Heathcliff has more actionable evil to him. And the funny thing to me is how the story is portrayed as being such a great romance. And it's so romantic when, in essence, it's not. I can't even tell you if the romance between Kathy and Heathcliff is genuine. Maybe on Heathcliff's side, but with her, it might have been just a narcissistic, just the desire of having someone love her. And she's just so selfish and so toxic. And there's something about Kathy that I feel like we never quite fully know her. And we have to remember this is being told to us. We never see or interact with her, not like with Heathcliff when Lockwood gets to. So, like, we don't know how much of this is true, how much of this is a lie, how good Kathy could have been, or how bad Kathy could have been. But from this interpretation, I love that they're trying to, it's at least showing to me that she's probably worse than you would think, but there's something about her that makes others kind of smudge the line, being like, well, she's not that bad. And like that's what makes Kathy fascinating to me is how toxic she is, how evil she kind of is underlying this. Continuing on with this description of Kathy, we're told that Kathy was, what did she say? She was never so happy as when we were all scolding her at once, and she defying us with her bold, saucy looks and her ready words, turning Joseph's religious curses into ridicule, baiting me and doing just what her father hated most, showing how her pretended insolence, which he thought real, had more power over Heathcliff than his kindness, and how the boy would do her bidding in anything in his only when it suited his own inclination. That perfectly summarizes Kathy. That shows that Kathy is so much more imp-like. That there's this evilness, this chaos to her. She is chaos incarnate. She is the one kind of bringing about and spurring this downfall of this family. One might think, or the way that Nellie's painting is, that Heathcliff coming into this house is what brought this family and this household down, but it's Kathy. Kathy is the center of this vortex. Heathcliff is just a minion of her. And we see it even here of how the kindness from Mr. Earnshaw was not enough. It only, Heathcliff would only do if it suited his own inclination, but he would do anything for Kathy. There's something about Kathy that was so alluring, so enticing, but yet she would also terrorize people. And that's what makes Kathy so fascinating. She is such a fascinating character because she does and completely does not fit within what a female main character should be, especially during this time. But even now, you're not getting characters quite like this. People would hate her. But for some reason, because we're being told by Nellie and by Heathcliff, we don't hear. And people actually, like Nellie, forget this negative side of her because they're so caught up in the romance between Kathy and Heathcliff and forget that this is not only a tragedy, but also that Kathy is a terrible person. One aspect of Wuthering Heights is this idea of parenting and upbringing, and it's not black and white, like nature versus nurture kind of thing. Like, it's not black and white. Like, you can try your best and still have a child turn out to be horrible and wicked. Case in point with Kathy, of how, after behaving as badly as possible all day, she sometimes came fondling to make it up at night. Nay, Kathy, the old man would say, I cannot love thee. Thou art worse than thy brother. Go say thy prayers, child, and ask God's pardon. I doubt thy mother and I must rue that we ever reared thee. That made her cry at first, and then being repulsed continually hardened her, and she laughed if I told her to say she was sorry for her faults and begged to be forgiven. And it's showing that her father, while his intentions was good, was trying to bring to light her wickedness and trying to get her to change her ways, to be good, and he turned to religion as a source because for him it worked. That's what he leans on, and at that time it would make sense, especially in the region that they lived in. But for Kathy, she always kind of laughed at it, and at first it upset her hearing her parents say that, but she did not change her ways. Even though it upset her, she wasn't willing to change her ways, and as he continued to say that to her, she just became hardened against it and more willful against it. And so that shows us again a lot more about Kathy, that her father, yes, he could have done things much better. He could have been a better parent, but he was trying his best, but, within the circumstances he had and with his own upbringing. Again, nothing's perfect. There's no perfect parenting. And it's hard when you have someone like Kathy, when you have that personality, you try your best, but the way that he was trying to do it did not work with Kathy and only kind of made her double down in her wickedness. It's fascinating to me personally that we don't get much focus on the early days, on the childhood, because I feel like that could be very influential. However, the story, because it is a story, does need to focus on the main events. That's what we tell other authors to do whenever I'm beta reading or editing, and others tell authors get come in late, leave early, and Emily Bronte is doing that. So we don't focus much on the childhood, despite how much I would love to know more. It's not the heart of the story, but she the events of the childhood is only a couple pages in Nellie's telling, and eventually Mr. Earnshaw does die, and she says he died quietly in his chair one October evening, seated by the fireside. And it's a rather peaceful passing. It's not a tragic passing like many others might experience. It's rather kind, what most would want in their lives when they're about to die. But the thing I want to focus on is the October, like that detail. She didn't have to tell us when, but she does. And we have to remember that Emily Bronte is writing during the Romanticism era. And during this era, symbolism was very present, I guess you could say. There's so many examples. So for October, it is, dead center of fall. It is the period of transition. In symbolism, winter is the end of a cycle, fall is transitioning into it, slowly coming out of the height of summer, going into, death, as you could say. Think of your English classes when you talked about Robert Frost, for example. That's what comes to my mind. But this makes sense that he would die supposedly in October because this is the height of a transition period. They've already been in the transition period of Heathcliff being introduced into their household. Earnshaw's death is the peak of this transition, but we're not quite at the death of the family because there's more transition to happen, as we will see in the following pages. You know how I said that Mr. Earnshaw dying in his favorite chair by the fire is very kind. It's a very gentle way of dying. It's not tragic in any sense. However, the rest of the scene surrounding his death is kind of horrifying. And the elements of it is almost like a painting, and you can pick at each detail. So, for instance, Nellie describes a high wind blustered around the house and roared in the chimney. First off, she's probably fictionalizing this because I doubt she remembers exactly the weather unless it was too crazy, which can be possible. Again, I'm going to reference, I brought this up in my If We're Villains, literary analysis, this opening episode of Serial with Anad Syed. The journalist interviews her like nephews and his friends about a random night and how it changes unless it's important. Like, you're not going to remember all the details. So that's why I want to bring up here. But Emily Bronte is writing during the Romanticism era, so this is important. And it's showing that the weather outside this house is chaotic. A storm is brewing, which is literally and figuratively happening within this household, too. And then we have Nellie sitting a little bit removed from their hearth, knitting. So Nellie is on the outskirts of this family. She's not at the focal point. She's not the center of the story of this drama. She's on the outside looking in, but also knitting. A very domestic kind of task that she is doing, and a very northern one too, because like if you're living up the north, it's gonna be colder, you're gonna need knitwear so much more. But like there is a like softness to that, whereas then you have Joseph, who is epitome, like she's the epitome of what a woman should be doing, and the Joseph is epitome of what like you would want your house would be like, with him reading the Bible near a table. For the servants generally sat in the house then after the work was done, which is showing this like unity, this family unit, that Mr. Earnshaw did not have hard black and white divides, which will happen soon after his death. There will be hard black and white divides between the servants in the household, with Hindley taking over. And then you had Kathy, who had been recently sick, and that made her still lent against her father's need. There's a gentleness to her in this one brief moment, and it was mostly because she had been recently sick. So it's showing that Kathy is capable of being sick, but also that when she is like that, she is still, and there's this like moment of serenity surrounding her. And Heathcliff was lying on the floor with his head in her lap. So I think it's showing also who they are trying to impress. Like Heathcliff's focus and intention is focused on Kathy, and he's trying to impress her and gain her approval, whereas Kathy, though she snubs it, secretly kind of yearns for her father's approval, and soon he will pass and she will never have it kind of sense too. But also like the tier system of it, I guess you can say, like the only one that can kind of rein Kathy in a little bit was her father, but even then not by much. But yeah, there's like this whole scene is just beautiful. It's like almost like a painting, and you just pick apart. There's more to it that you can pick apart with. I would love to know what you think of this scene. Before Mr. Earnshaw had passed, Kathy's head is upon his knee, and he's running his fingers through her hair, and he says, "Why canst thou not always be a good lass, Kathy?" And she turned her face up to his and laughed and answered, "Why cannot you always be a good man, father?" But as soon as she saw him vexed again, she kissed his hand and said she would sing him to sleep. First, Kathy is the epitome of a Sour Patch Kid. Like, she has sour punches practically with his words being like, why can't you be a good man? But then it's sweet, trying to like be like, forget that. I'm going to sing you to sleep. And she does this to everyone. It was just told to us practically by Nellie the other page that she does this often, where she will vex people and then make them forget and then focus back on her. But also, her comment is very fascinating because I love that he's saying, like, why can't you be a good lass? And she's like, why can't you be a good man? It's almost like a very feminine kind of approach here. It's like, you cannot expect one to be good, but not the other. We, as humans, we both have to be good. We have to remember that the Romanticism era is also coming out of a disillusionment of the Enlightenment era. These ideas that were forming, revolutions and new governments, but they saw the horror of it, for example, with the French Revolution, that they're now disillusioned with humanity and they're looking more towards humans individually and symbolism, romanticism. Like, I have a whole video on my YouTube going into like romanticism and enlightenment and a couple ways with Jane Austen, the history that she written during, and I also talk about it with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes because it's relevant there. But getting back here, it's very fascinating that she is hitting back, being like, we both have to be good. You can't expect just me. But it's fascinating that, like, she's pointing out that, like, he's not perfect either, but it could be like a jealous kind of like a childlike response, like, well, not, you're not. But the other thing I'm going to point out is the language, which I never really thought about, which is that the way that the father talks, which is, why canst thou not always be a good lass, Kathy? And she says, why cannot you always be a good man, father? It's a little harder unless you see it. If you look at the text, in my copy of the book is page 51, you can more see the difference, that there's a different style of talking, which is like, I think represent that the father is the old way of like, and very kind of provincial kind of talk. There's a very older English to it, where she is the new generation, but also the step towards society, a step towards more refined talk, more like what Lockwood would be talking like coming from London. And so there's a difference between the two of them. And I think there's a slight commentary on the difference between generations and how the younger always is trying to act in opposite of the elder, for example. But there's probably more people can talk about with just the language itself. I am not an expert in it, but I need to find some papers. Maybe I read on academic and come back and talk about it. But I would love to know what you think about the difference in the language here too, because it's not just Joseph. I didn't realize that it's also the father is talking very much this way too. Once again, we get a subtle showing of the power dynamics and the changing, like it was previously stated by Nellie, that as the master became sick, Joseph gained more power in this household. And you see it here when he says that we all kept as mute as mice for a full half hour and should have done so longer, only Joseph, having finished his chapter, got up and said that he must rouse the master for prayers in bed. And it's him rousing the master for prayers in bed, like he is a parent telling a child, like, all right, time to get up, we got to go to bed, but you got to do your prayers. There's a dynamic here, a power dynamics, where all of a sudden Joseph has more power in this household, a command over the master, the literal supposed master of this household. But yet Joseph is commanding him what to do. So we're seeing the changing of the guard almost happening in this scene too, of Hindley missing, but soon Hindley will come and it will be kind of a shared power we will see between the two of them upon Kathy and Heathcliff. But like I said earlier, we see this very less black and white divide between servants and household, but also seeing a very interesting power dynamics going on here right now too. As I previously mentioned, the Romanticism era is very rich with symbolism, and this is usually where the text that you're using in your English classes. This is the conversation about, what does the candle mean? What are the shades actually blue? And I love these kind of symbolism, like dissecting. That's my favorite thing to do if you watch any of my other literary analysis. And it existed prior to this too, like take Shakespeare has a lot of it also, but it's just the Romanticism era really leaned into it. And it's coming out of a like era of a little bit more like literary, if that makes sense. Like they were literal period of writing, and then you're gonna go back into a literal period of writing, like more or less figurative, I guess you could say. Like it goes in waves, like everything else in culture. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is between these 2 pages in my copy of 1551, we have this like description of nature, which is very prevalent in Romanticism era writing, is using nature mixed with a moment of emotion within the scene. So in the beginning of the scene is being painted by Nellie is saying a high wind blustered around the house and roared in the chimney. And then as the scene is reaching its climax that Nellie is retelling, when they find out that Mr. Earnshaw had died, Nellie said, I joined my wails to theirs, loud and bitter, but just Joseph asked what we could be thinking of to roar in that way over Saint in heaven. The roar is what caught my attention and connected the two, but it makes sense. It's showing that the nature outside is mirroring the emotions inside. And it's very interesting because often people describe wind as sounding like wails. So instead of leaning on that connection, she leans on the roaring. But the point of it is to show that even if this is fictionalized or exaggerated by Nellie, is showing how intense the emotion was for Nellie this moment in time, how important this moment was. And like, yeah, all that. It's just like they emphasize that and then make the readers feel the intensity of it too. The end of the scene is very important, and there's something here, and I'm going to try my best at picking at it, but I would love to know what you think about it, because there's something here, as I'm saying, because Nellie says that she returns from getting like the doctor and the parson as Joseph commanded and goes to seek Kathy and Heathcliff, who were just children at the time, to comfort them, but discovers that they did not need to be consoled because they were consoling themselves. And she said the little souls were comforting each other with better thoughts than I could have hit on. No parson in the world ever pictured heaven so beautifully as they did in their innocent talk, and while I sobbed and listened, I could not help wishing we were all there safe together. Sorry, that was my cat. um, but the reason why I want to point this out is that I think it's showing the innocence of them, that there is, like, despite Kathy's mischievousness, despite her being almost a black hole, as I often describe her, despite Heathcliff's later revengeance that he seeks, it's there's an innocence to them. There's still this childlike innocence which comes out of a philosophical theory that kind of came out of the Enlightenment period, of how I think it's Hobbes, I want to say. It's been a little bit since I was reading these philosophies, but again, if you check out my YouTube channel, I've done a video about these different philosophies, more specifically with the philosophies in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I go into some of them, and I want to say it was Hobbes talked about how when children are born, they're kind of tabula rosa, blank slate. And so like anything could be imposed upon them, that like that kind of like, not, you're not born evil, you're not born good, but you are nurtured to be. So it's the nature versus nurture kind of conversation being had here too. But it's interesting that it's being had here. It's a slight reminder that despite everything we're going to hear about these two, despite what we've heard thus far, they're still children and they are still innocent. And there is this beauty and wonder to them. They aren't demon spawns. They are envisioning heaven to be beautiful, this beautiful place. And that is very important, especially with the end of this book, with how so many years they've tortured each other of not reaching heaven per se. And again, the religion is a very important part of this story also. As I mentioned in a previous chapter of like Locke, we're talking about the religion in his dreams and being in a church, and the religion of like Kathy wandering the moors seeking, rest, all these things. So I would love to know what your opinion is about this final scene in this moment here. Again, there's something more and I can't quite put my finger on it, that it's important, but that was my best and I don't want to ramble too much longer. So that's the end of chapter 5. Come back for chapter 6.